The tiny white puppy wouldn't stop barking, wouldn't leave him alone, and when Richard finally followed it off the road, he discovered something in those woods that he wasn't prepared for. Something that would force him to confront the darkest moment of his past. But by then, it was almost too late. Before we proceed, drop your locations in the comments right now, and when this story ends, rate it from 0 to 10. Set? Let's dive in. The sun hadn't yet burned through the morning mist when Officer Richard turned onto Maple Ridge Road, the last stretch of his patrol. At 28, he'd learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the world woke up just him, the hum of the engine, and miles of empty asphalt. Then he saw it. A tiny white puppy stood planted in the center of the lane, trembling but refusing to move. Richard slowed the cruiser to a stop, frowning. Lost dogs weren't unusual out here, but something about the way this one stared at him made his chest tighten. He stepped out. "Hey there, buddy. You okay?" The puppy didn't run. Instead, it trotted forward, whimpering low in its throat, and clamped its teeth gently around the hem of his pant leg. Richard knelt, reaching to pick it up, but the dog released him and bolted several yards down the road before stopping abruptly. It turned back, barking sharp, urgent, desperate. Richard's instincts prickled. "What are you trying to tell me?" The puppy barked again, then ran toward the edge of the road where wildflowers swayed in the breeze. It stopped at the tree line, looked back, and whined. Richard's hand hovered over his radio, then dropped. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he'd felt it 17 years ago when his mother's face had gone pale answering the phone call about his father's accident. He followed. The puppy led him through the field, weaving between purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans. Richard's boots crushed the dewy grass as memories pressed against his ribs. His father's patrol car, the overturned truck, the way no one had found him in time. They reached the forest edge where shadows pooled thick beneath the canopy. The puppy plunged into the darkness without hesitation, and Richard followed, his pulse quickening with every step. Then he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it, a low, ragged moan rising from somewhere deeper in the woods. Richard's blood turned to ice. "Hello?" he called out, breaking into a run. "Can you hear me?" The puppy's barking grew frantic, echoing through the trees like a siren he couldn't ignore. Richard crashed through the underbrush, branches clawing at his uniform as he chased the sound. The puppy stayed just ahead of him, its white fur a ghost in the shadows, barking with such raw desperation that Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. "I'm coming!" he shouted, though he didn't know if anyone could hear him. The puppy led him around a massive oak, then stopped so suddenly Richard nearly tripped over it. The dog planted its paws in the dirt and howled a sound too big, too broken for such a small creature. Richard's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and that's when he saw it. The ground ahead was torn up, littered with broken branches and fresh dirt. A section of dead wood that looked like an old collapsed shelter or hunting blind lay scattered across the forest floor. And there, barely visible beneath the debris, was the scuffed leather toe of a boot. "Oh, God." Richard lunged forward, his training snapping into focus. His hands moved on autopilot, reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need paramedics at the north end of Maple Ridge, approximately 200 yards into the forest off—" The puppy's bark cut through his words, sharp and unrelenting. It was digging now, clawing frantically at the pile of branches, whimpering between barks as if begging Richard to move faster. Richard dropped to his knees beside the wreckage and began tearing away the debris. Rotted wood splintered beneath his grip. Leaves and dirt filled his lungs. His fingers closed around a thick branch and he hurled it aside, then another, and another. The boot became a leg, then a torso, then an arm. Richard froze. The man's hand was curled protectively around something small and motionless. Another puppy, its fur matted with blood and dirt, lying perfectly still against the man's chest. "No," No, no, Richard whispered, yanking away more branches. The white puppy pressed against his side, trembling violently now, whining in a voice that sounded almost human. Richard's hands found the man's neck, searching for a pulse. Faint, barely there, but alive. Richard worked faster, adrenaline flooding his veins as he tore away the last of the debris. The man beneath was middle-aged, his face pale and bruised, blood seeping from a gash above his temple. A massive branch had pinned his torso, crushing his chest beneath its weight. The white puppy scrambled forward, trying desperately to reach the man's face, whining in broken, pitiful sounds. "Stay back, buddy," Richard murmured, but his voice cracked. He grabbed his radio again. "Dispatch, I have one male victim, critical condition, trapped under fallen wood. I need paramedics now. How far out are they?" Static crackled. "Unit 12 EMS is en route. The estimated arrival time is 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Richard looked down at the man's shallow breathing, at the blood pooling beneath him. 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours. He gripped the heavy branch and pulled with everything he had. It shifted slightly, and the man's eyes fluttered open, glassy, unfocused, searching. Hey, I've got you," Richard said, leaning close. "Help is coming. Just hang on." The man's lips moved, barely a whisper. "Save him." Richard followed his gaze to the tiny, injured puppy still cradled against the man's chest. Its breathing was labored, its little body limp. "I will," Richard promised. "But I need you to stay with me, okay? Stay with me." The man's hand reached up, trembling, and closed weakly around Richard's sleeve. His mouth opened again, but no words came. Just a wet, rattling breath. Then his grip went slack. No, don't do this!" Richard pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck. Nothing. He started chest compressions, counting under his breath, but he already knew. The man's eyes stared past him, vacant and still. Richard's hands froze. For a moment, he wasn't in the forest anymore. He was 11 years old again, sitting in a hospital hallway, watching his father's hand slip from his mother's grasp, watching the light fade from eyes that looked just like his own. The white puppy's soft cry snapped him back. Richard blinked hard, forcing himself to move. He scooped the injured puppy from the dead man's arms, so small, so fragile, and cradled it against his chest. The white puppy followed at his heels as he bolted through the trees. He burst onto the road, threw open the cruiser door, and laid the injured pup gently on the passenger seat. The engine roared to life. Sirens screamed, and Richard drove like hell itself was chasing him. The speedometer climbed past 80. Richard's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The injured puppy lay across his lap, its shallow breaths barely moving its tiny chest. The white puppy sat rigid in the passenger seat, eyes locked on its sibling. Richard's vision blurred. Not from tears, he couldn't let himself cry yet, but from the memories crashing over him in waves. His father's patrol car, twisted metal against a guardrail, the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber, his mother's hand crushing his as they waited in that too-bright hospital corridor. The doctor's face when he came through those double doors. "Not again," Richard whispered through gritted teeth. "Not this time." He blew through a stop sign, tires squealing as he took a corner too fast. The puppy whimpered, and Richard's hand moved instinctively to steady it against his chest. The little creature pressed closer, as if it understood, as if it knew Richard was fighting for both their lives. "Hold on, buddy. Just hold on." The emergency vet clinic appeared like a beacon. Richard didn't bother with a parking spot. He slammed the brakes in front of the entrance, threw the door open, and ran. The bell above the door hadn't finished chiming before he was at the counter. "I need help. Now!" A young technician looked up, startled, then saw the limp puppy in Richard's arms. Her eyes widened. "Exam room 2, go!" Richard followed her through the swinging doors. A veterinarian appeared instantly, gray-haired and steady-handed, already pulling on gloves. Richard laid the puppy on the cold metal table, his hands shaking so badly he could barely let go. "What happened?" the vet asked, pressing a stethoscope to the puppy's chest. There was a man, crushed under debris. He was protecting them. The man's dead. This one's been injured at least an hour, maybe more. I got here as fast as I could. You did good." The vet's voice was calm, practiced. She nodded to her team and they moved like clockwork, hooking up monitors, checking vitals, preparing equipment. Richard backed away as they worked. His shoulders hitting the wall, his legs gave out and he slid to the floor, head in his hands. The white puppy pressed against his boot, trembling. The vet glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "We'll do all we can." Then she disappeared behind a swinging door, taking the puppy with her. And all Richard could do was wait. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. Richard sat hunched in a plastic chair, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. The white puppy had finally settled at his feet, exhausted but refusing to leave his side. Every time the door to the back rooms opened, Richard's head snapped up. Every time it was someone else. He looked down at the white puppy, noticing for the first time the worn leather collar around its neck frayed edges, no tags, the kind you'd see on a rescue or a stray someone had tried to help. Whoever that man in the woods was, he'd cared enough to take in these dogs. And now he was gone. The front door chimed. 2 investigators stepped inside, badges clipped to their belts. Richard recognized the taller one, Detective Marsh from the county office. "Officer Hayes," Marsh said, his voice low and respectful. "We need your statement." Richard nodded and stood, his legs stiff from sitting. They moved to a quieter corner of the lobby. He recounted everything: the puppy in the road, the forest trail, the collapsed structure, the dying man's final words. His voice stayed steady, professional, even as his chest felt like it was caving in. "We processed the scene," Marsh said when Richard finished. "Looks like an old hunting blind or makeshift shelter gave way. Rotted wood, probably weakened by last week's storms. The victim appears to have been hiking alone. We're running his prints now, trying to identify him." "He wasn't alone," Richard said quietly. "He had them." Marsh followed his gaze to the white puppy. His expression softened. "Yeah, he did." After the investigators left, Richard sank back into his chair. His hands were still trembling. He turned them over and saw a smear of dried blood across his palm, rusty brown against his skin. The injured puppy's blood. The man's blood. He wasn't sure anymore. If I'd gotten there 5 minutes earlier, if I'd driven faster, if I'd followed the puppy sooner. The guilt pressed down on him like that branch had pressed down on the man's chest. The door to the back rooms swung open. Richard looked up. The veterinarian stood in the doorway, still in her blood-stained scrubs, her face drawn and serious. She met his eyes, and for a long, terrible moment, she didn't say anything at all. Then her expression softened. "He's stable." Richard's breath left him in a rush. "He'll live," she continued, stepping closer. "But Officer Hayes, if you'd arrived even 5 minutes later, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You saved his life." Relief hit Richard like a wave, buckling his knees. He gripped the edge of the chair to steady himself, but it wasn't enough. The emotion he'd been holding back for hours, years, maybe came flooding out. His eyes burned, his throat closed. He turned away, shoulders shaking. The white puppy pressed against his leg, whining softly. "Can I?" Richard's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Can I see him?" "Of course." The vet led him through the swinging doors into a quiet recovery room. The injured puppy lay in a small kennel lined with soft blankets, an IV line taped to his tiny leg. bandages wrapped around his torso, but his eyes were open. Richard knelt beside the kennel, his heart hammering. "Hey, little guy." The puppy's tail gave the faintest wag. Then, despite the pain it must have caused, he crawled forward on trembling legs until his nose pressed against the kennel door. Richard opened it without thinking. The puppy climbed into his hands, so small and fragile, and curled against Richard's chest. A soft, broken sound escaped Richard's throat, something between a laugh and a sob. "I've got you," he whispered. "You're safe now." The puppy sighed, a tiny, trusting sound, and closed his eyes. Behind him, the door opened. Detective Marsh stepped inside, his expression somber. "We identified the victim. Daniel Reeves, 43. No criminal record. Looks like he was a drifter, moved around a lot. And Officer Hayes—" Marsh paused. He had no next of kin. No family at all. Richard closed his eyes, his hand gently stroking the puppy's head. The vet spoke quietly from the doorway. "Officer Hayes, what will happen to the puppies?" Richard looked down at the tiny creature in his arms, the one who'd fought so hard to survive, who'd trusted a stranger's hands, who'd already lost everything. He thought of the white puppy waiting in the lobby, loyal and brave beyond measure. He thought of the man who'd given his last breath protecting them. And Richard knew. "They're coming home with me," he whispered. The puppy's paw pressed against his chest, right over his heart. 3 days later, Detective Marsh called with the full report. His name was Timothy Walker, Marsh said over the phone. 51 years old. No permanent address for the past decade. Moved from town to town, mostly working odd jobs in construction, landscaping, that sort of thing. But here's the thing, Hayes. Every place he stayed, people remembered him for the same reason. He rescued dogs. Richard sat at his kitchen table, the white puppy asleep at his feet, the injured one still recovering, resting in a soft bed nearby. Rescued them? Strays, mostly. He'd find them, get them healthy, then rehome them when he moved on. According to witnesses, he never kept more than 1 or 2 at a time. These 2... Marsh paused. They were his only companions when he died. Richard's throat tightened. He saved them. He did more than that. The coroner's report came back. The way Timothy's body was positioned when the structure collapsed, he threw himself over those puppies, Hayes, took the full impact on his back and shoulders. Without that, they wouldn't have survived. Richard closed his eyes, the image searing itself into his mind. A man with nothing, giving everything. The memorial was small, just Richard, Marsh, a county chaplain, and a temporary marker in the municipal cemetery. No flowers had been sent. No family came to mourn. So Richard brought his own. He knelt in the grass, laying a simple bouquet of wildflowers, the same kind that grew in the field where it all began. His hand rested on the cold temporary marker, fingers tracing Timothy Walker's name. "I don't know if you can hear me," Richard said quietly, his voice thick. "But I wanted you to know they're safe. Both of them. And I promise you, I swear to you, I'll give them the life you would have wanted, the life you deserved." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and rain. Richard stood, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. The injured puppy was still too fragile to travel far, but Richard had brought the white one with him. It sat patiently at his feet, looking up at him with those dark, knowing eyes. Richard scooped the puppy into his arms and held him close, the way you'd hold a child. "Let's go home," he whispered. And as he walked away from the memorial grounds, the puppy tucked against his chest, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in 17 years. Peace. Richard named him Chance. "Because you gave me one," he murmured the first night home, as the tiny puppy curled into the crook of his arm. "And maybe I gave you one too." The white puppy who Richard had named Scout for, leading him through the forest, watched from his own bed nearby, protective and calm. The days that followed were a blur of vet visits, sleepless nights, and small victories. Chance's wounds healed slowly, but his spirit recovered faster. He followed Richard everywhere, those dark eyes tracking his every movement with absolute trust. Richard learned what it meant to care for something fragile again. The first bath was a disaster, Chance shivering and whimpering until Richard climbed into the tub with him, fully clothed, whispering reassurances. Training was even harder. Chance was stubborn, easily distracted, and Richard found himself laughing for the first time in months when the puppy dragged an entire roll of paper towels through the house. But it was the nights that changed everything. Chance had nightmares. He'd wake up trembling, whining in the dark, and Richard would scoop him up and hold him against his chest until the fear passed. Those moments, feeling the puppy's racing heartbeat slow beneath his palm, cracked something open inside Richard that he'd kept sealed for 17 years. One night, 3 weeks after bringing Chance home, Richard sat on the floor of his living room, exhausted from a double shift. Chance climbed into his lap, rested his head on Richard's knee, and simply looked at him. And Richard broke. The tears came without warning, years of grief, guilt, and buried pain pouring out in ragged sobs. He thought of his father. He thought of Timothy Walker. He thought of all the people he couldn't save, all the moments he'd been too late. Chance didn't run. He didn't flinch. The puppy crawled up Richard's chest and licked the tears from his face, his small body pressed tight against Richard's heart. Then he nuzzled into the space beneath Richard's chin and stayed there, warm and steady and real. Richard wrapped his arms around the tiny creature and held on like he was drowning. "We saved each other, didn't we?" he whispered into Chance's fur. Chance's tail wagged once, soft, certain. Scout padded over and rested his head on Richard's leg, completing the circle. And for the first time since he was 11 years old, Richard Hayes felt whole. The adoption paperwork sat on Richard's kitchen counter, signed and dated. Official. Final. Chance and Scout were his now, not just in his heart, but in every legal sense that mattered. Richard ran his thumb across the embossed county seal, then looked down at Chance, who sat at his feet watching him with those soulful eyes. "What do you say we take a drive?" 20 minutes later, Richard stood at the edge of Maple Ridge Road, the same stretch of asphalt where everything had changed. Chance walked beside him on a new red leash, stronger now, his gait steady and sure. Scout trotted ahead, nose to the ground, tail high. Richard led them through the wildflower field, purple coneflowers still blooming despite the approaching autumn, and into the forest. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden beams. When they reached the clearing, Richard stopped. The debris had been cleared by the county bomb, but the ground still bore the scars, disturbed dirt, broken branches pushed to the side. Richard knelt and pulled a simple wooden marker from his backpack. He'd made it himself in his garage, carving Timothy Walker's name with careful, reverent strokes. He drove it into the soft earth with a rock, then sat back on his heels. "I wish I could have known you," Richard said quietly. "I wish I could have told you what you meant. Not just to them, to me." Chance sat beside him without being asked, pressing his small body against Richard's leg. Scout circled once, then settled on Richard's other side. Richard reached down and pulled Chance into his arms, holding him close as emotion welled up again, but this time it wasn't grief, it was gratitude. "I thought I was saving you," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. "But you brought me back to life." Chance licked his jaw once, then rested his head on Richard's shoulder. The three of them sat there in the dappled sunlight, surrounded by the quiet forest, honoring a man who'd given everything and asking for nothing in return. Finally, Richard stood. He took one last look at the marker, then turned toward the open field beyond the trees. "Come on, boys," he said softly. "Let's go home." Chance walked at his side, leash slack, perfectly in step. Scout led the way, confident and sure, and as they emerged from the shadows into the sunlit field, Richard felt something settle deep in his chest, not an ending, but a beginning. A second chance. For all of them. Did this story captivate you? Share your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and tell us what you think. Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you will never miss our next story.